I joined the Navy for the same reason most do: order, direction, a paycheck that didn't bounce. But I stayed for something else. Silence. Real silence. Not the romanticized stillness poets ramble about, but the true cold hush that only exists beneath several hundred meters of ocean, where everything is heavy, slow, deliberate, where you can hear things not meant to be heard. That silence became my home, and sonar, active and passive, became my language. I could tell you what kind of whale was passing based on a blip of sound so faint it barely scratched the equipment. I could distinguish between a Soviet diesel sub and a drifting container ship in my sleep. That's how I knew, beyond any shadow of doubt, that the signal we picked up that night wasn't ours. And it wasn't theirs either. It was a routine patrol off the Philippine Trench, a zone we were told to classify as acoustically inactive, which had always struck me as bureaucratic nonsense. There's no such thing as an acoustically inactive trench. Not at those depths. You just can't hear it with the toys civilians get to play with. But we had better equipment, and I'd fine-tuned my array to the point that I could hear things a week before they reached us. It was around 00340 Zulu when I caught the first pulse. Just one. Deep, rounded, nearly organic, but it had harmonics that made the hair on my neck rise. At first I thought it was a false contact, maybe a calibration glitch. So I ran diagnostics. Everything was clean. No interference, no hardware failure, no environmental anomalies. But the pulse came again. Stronger this time. It wasn't bouncing off anything. It was originating in free space. That's not how sonar works. Something was transmitting from a depth that didn't officially exist. I reported it up the chain. Our commander, Lieutenant Bishop, reviewed the spectrogram and raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Just ordered me to log it and resume standard monitoring. But something in his face cracked when he looked at the data. I'd seen Bishop stare down war games with a poker face. This disturbed him. We weren't the only ones who noticed. 2 hours later, we got a comm from a blacked-out vessel designated Raven 6, requesting coordinates. That's not normal. Raven-designated ships don't talk to regular patrol units. They observe. They collect. They don't respond to hails, and they don't transmit location data. But there they were, asking us where we heard the anomaly. Not a peep about what it could be. Just cold, clipped language. Coordinates confirmed. Hold position. Await further instruction. I kept listening. The signal didn't stop. It began to shift. Slowly. Like a living thing repositioning in the dark. Not random. There was structure to it. Echo spacing, decay rates, harmonics. All wrong for a natural event. And then, it hit me. The pattern wasn't random at all. It was responding. Not to us, but to something else. Something deeper. There were overlapping frequencies, like two conversations happening under the same breath. We were listening to a dialogue not meant for us. I isolated the low-band components and ran them through a spectral analyzer. The waveforms were tight, focused, almost like language, but not linguistic. Compressed meaning. Information sent through pressure itself. The rest of the techs on board didn't want to hear it. They had their assignments, their routines, their chain of command to obey. But I couldn't let it go. That night, I skipped sleep and stayed in the sonar bay. The lights flickered every 32 minutes. Not a second more or less. That's not a system fault. That's a frequency bleed. And every time the lights dimmed, the signal spiked. I started to hear things through the transducers. Not just pulses, but textures. Wet, granular textures. Sounds that suggested mass and proximity. There was a weight to the signal. Like something pressing inward. Trying to compress not just the hull, but our minds. That same night, Petty Officer Green had a breakdown in the galley. Started screaming about a dream. Something with teeth the size of hull plates and eyes made of lights that blinked in reverse. He was restrained and sedated. No one mentioned it again. The next day, a classified directive was handed to Bishop. We were ordered to disable all active sonar pings and shift to passive only. That's suicide in hostile waters. Without active pings, we're blind. But the order was stamped by command tiers I'd never even seen before. Bishop followed it without protest. The passive system kept recording, though, and that's when I realized something that's kept me awake since. The signal had moved with us. Not following. Not trailing. Just accompanying. Matching our depth changes. Adjusting to our velocity. Like a tether we couldn't see. I suggested to Bishop that we surface and reevaluate. He just looked at me and said, "We're not in control anymore, technician." That's when I knew this wasn't just a rogue sub or geological anomaly. We had trespassed into something. 2 days later, a civilian specialist was helicoptered in. Dr. Clemens, linguist, and acoustic theorist. Not military. No insignia. No expression. He walked into the sonar bay, reviewed our recordings without saying a word, and then plugged in a device I'd never seen before. It looked like a tuning fork mated with a hard drive. He played something through the transducers. It wasn't from our logs. It was a reply. I don't know how he had it. I don't know who authorized it. But the moment it played, the signal outside stopped. Just silence. Not ocean silence. Not pressure silence. Absence. Total and perfect. My stomach turned. Dr. Clemens smiled faintly and said, "Acknowledged." Then he packed up and left the room. That night, I dreamed of pressure. Not water. Not drowning. Just pressure. Endless. Spiraling down into chambers that pulsed like lungs made of stone. I woke up gasping, and I swear, my skin had shifted just slightly, like something had pushed from the inside. I tried to tell Bishop. He wasn't in his quarters. His bunk was untouched. No one saw him after 0200. We were told he was transferred to another vessel, but his personal logbook remained in the control room. The last entry read, "It hurt us, and it doesn't forget." I don't think any of this was accidental. We were sent there for a reason. The trench, the signal, the timing. It all fits a profile. We weren't mapping seafloor anomalies. We were part of an ongoing interaction, one that started before any of us were born. And I fear, long after we're gone, it will still be listening. Waiting for the right frequency, the right voice. When I was trained as a sonar technician, they drilled into us the concept of bathymetry, how the seafloor is mapped, how depths are measured and interpreted. Everything has a bottom. That was the rule. Mountains have peaks, trenches have floors. The Mariana has its known deepest point. So do the Kermadec and the Philippine. But what they never told us is that known is a word we use when we've run out of ways to measure. That there are places the signal simply doesn't bounce back. It just keeps going. Places the ocean refuses to finish. After the incident with Dr. Clemens, something shifted aboard. The chain of command grew quiet. The crew moved differently. Quicker, tighter, like people trying not to attract attention even in empty corridors. No one talked about Bishop's disappearance. His name was scrubbed from the watch rotations and replaced by someone we'd never seen. A man named Commander Rhodes who wore a Navy uniform like it was a borrowed costume. His eyes never matched his words. And when he walked by, the temperature seemed to drop a few degrees. He introduced himself only once, in a general announcement that sounded more like a warning than a greeting. You are to remain within your designated zones. No sonar sweeps unless authorized. If you hear anything unusual, log it and alert the bridge immediately. Do not interpret. Do not respond. I returned to my station with the weight of those words sinking deeper into my ribs. The signal hadn't returned, not in its full form, but every so often there would be a flicker, a pressure shift, a harmonic whisper that tickled the edges of the spectrum. I began logging them manually. They didn't fit any known oceanic model. Worse, they weren't originating from the trench anymore. They were coming from beneath us, directly beneath us. But when I mapped the depth based on delay returns and acoustic shadowing, the numbers stopped making sense. The signal was reflecting from a point that didn't have a floor. We were above a depth with no end. I brought this to Chief O'Reilly, our most seasoned engineer, and one of the few still willing to talk like a human being. He took one look at the echo readouts, frowned, and said, "That's a ghost band. Happens when you get thermal anomalies, messes with return times." I could tell he didn't believe his own words. There were no thermal shifts, no tectonic rumblings, just silence. And then, a sound that didn't belong. I went over every reading with the meticulousness of a man trying to disprove his own madness. But there it was again, an echo returning not from rock or silt, but from motion, from a pressure pocket. Something massive, something breathing. I cross-referenced the times of the signals with the flickers in the electrical systems, still occurring every 32 minutes. And then something dawned on me. The flickers weren't failures. They were sync points. Every time they happened, the signal reset. Like clockwork, like coordination. Something down there wasn't just alive. It was timing us. Timing our reactions. Measuring latency. Gauging how long it took for us to notice, to panic, to act. One night, just past 0300, I made a mistake. I activated a short, low-intensity ping, not strong enough to trigger alert systems, but enough to reach further down. I wanted to know. I needed to. The ping dropped into the abyss, slicing through the dark like a scalpel, and it never came back. Not even a faint echo, just void. That's not physically possible. Sound always reflects. Always. Unless there's nothing. Or unless something is swallowing it. I didn't sleep after that. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd feel the reverberation. Not in my ears, but in my spine. Like something was humming through my bones. A slow, circular hum. Impossibly deep. Impossibly low. The kind that doesn't register as sound, but as memory. I tried to record it. Nothing came through. I asked Petty Officer Lang to sit with me during one of the monitoring shifts. He listened, confused, and said he didn't hear anything unusual. But then, 10 minutes in, he got up without a word and walked out. I found him later staring at the walls of the storage bay, murmuring about shapes that aren't shapes, and eyes without orientation. He was transferred the next morning. The crew was thinning. No one was saying it, but we all felt it. People were going missing, not in groups, one at a time, subtly, their names removed from rosters, their quarters cleared without trace. When I asked Rhodes, he replied coldly, "Personnel reassignments are above your clearance." That was it. No explanations. No names. But we all knew. And beneath it all, the silence kept stretching. On the 6th night after the ping, the trench answered back. It wasn't a reply in the human sense. It was a sound that arrived all at once, like a chord struck across miles of ocean, but with no identifiable origin. It bypassed the hydrophones and shuddered through the hull like a hand on the skin of the vessel. Every surface vibrated with it. Lights dimmed and didn't return. Consoles spat static in patterns. Morse-like, but unreadable. I tried to isolate the wave, filter it, assign logic. I couldn't. It was chaos. But then, after hours of reviewing the data, I realized the patterns weren't in the signal. They were in us. Heart rates, breath cycles, movement patterns. The sound had mapped us. It had drawn our silhouettes in pressure. It knew what we were. The next day, the engineers discovered water intrusion in one of the lower storage hatches. Except it wasn't seawater. It was darker, denser, slightly warm. It moved unnaturally, pooling and retracting against gravity. They sealed the hatch and declared it a leak. But I watched as one of the crew tested the liquid's salinity. His instruments didn't register anything. Nothing. As if it wasn't composed of any known substance. And I saw it. Just once. When they drained the area. A shape, brief and impossible, rising against the current. Like a shadow pretending to be liquid. Then gone. Rhodes called a ship-wide briefing the next morning. For the first time, he looked shaken. He didn't read from a script. Didn't pace or gesture. He simply said, "We are under observation. Remain inside your designated areas. Do not engage in unauthorized monitoring. This is not a drill." Then he left. Just like that. No questions allowed. That night, I found his quarters empty. No trace of departure. Just like Bishop. I stopped logging the signals in the mainframe. I began keeping my own records, on a separate device. Paranoid? Maybe. But when truth becomes dangerous, the only protection is secrecy. I started to suspect we were never meant to return. That the platform wasn't just a monitoring station. It was bait. A lure. A signal tower calling something out of a depth without floor. And then came the whisper. Not in my ears. Not through the speakers. But inside the space behind thought. A suggestion. Slow and clear. It didn't use words. It didn't need to. It simply said, "Closer." I didn't tell anyone about the whisper. Not at first, because it wasn't something I could reproduce. It didn't leave behind a waveform. There was no audio trail, no digital residue. It was like trying to prove you had a dream without dreaming out loud. But I knew it had happened, and I knew it wasn't mine. It wasn't born in my head. It was placed there, like a note slid under a locked door. Closer. That's what it said. Not in a language, but in a force of direction. In a pull so specific it overrode fear. And I began to feel it physically. An orientation I'd never been trained to recognize. Something beneath the compass, beneath the gyroscope. Something inside the gravity well of thought itself. Like a depth calling to another depth. After Rhodes vanished, command fell to Lieutenant Delaney, who was young, too composed, too polished to be anything other than selected, not promoted, chosen. She gave orders the way you might recite instructions from a classified manual. Not a single deviation. Minimal movement between sectors. All external sweeps require Level 2 clearance. Compartmentalize, compartmentalize, compartmentalize. That was the word she kept repeating, like it was some kind of spell meant to keep the platform from unraveling. But it was already happening. Sections were failing one by one. Environmental control in Habitation Block C. Oxygen variability in Engineering Bay 2. Signal redundancy down in all backup towers. The official explanation was pressure fatigue. But we all knew fatigue didn't crawl through air vents and leave the walls wet. That week, I was reassigned to work with Petty Officer Rem on external hydroacoustic calibration. It was the Navy's way of saying, go outside and make sure the ghosts aren't screaming too loud. Rem was a bitter man. 20 years in, 5 deployments, the kind of face that had been punched more times than smiled. But he was smart. Too smart to still be on a floating coffin like this. They don't promote the ones who know when to keep their mouths shut, he told me, wiping condensation off the inside of his visor before we descended in the lift toward the subdeck. They leave us where we won't be heard. The subdeck was worse than I remembered. The further down we went, the more the metal moaned. Not from the current, not from structural tension, but from something slower, like breathing. The weld lines seemed to pulse, not visibly, but in my bones. I kept having to shake my head to break the sensation that the platform was stretching, that we weren't stationary above the trench but sliding, ever so slightly, towards something. We accessed one of the lower sonar arrays, housed in an external alcove exposed directly to the trench. Rem ran the diagnostic while I monitored feedback from the hydrophones. The moment we powered up the transducer, I felt it again. The hum. Except this time, it wasn't subtle. It was rhythm, structure, pulse. I began recording. The frequency was low. Impossibly low, infrasonic. But it was there. Sustained, consistent, not natural. It wasn't biological. It wasn't seismic. It was intentional. And then, without warning, it changed. The waveform shifted. Not randomly. It aligned itself. Matched our diagnostic ping, beat for beat. Then it phased slightly out of sync, by exactly 3.8 milliseconds. That's when I realized it was copying us. Rem saw it too. His eyes locked on the monitor. It's running parallel, he whispered. That's not an echo. That's a reply. He didn't blink. I don't think he could. The signal we sent out, meant to be nothing more than a routine calibration ping, was being answered in real time. The reply wasn't identical, but it was close. Like a mirror drawn by memory instead of light. Then came the distortion. A ripple in the phase. The signal began morphing, folding over itself, introducing harmonic intervals we hadn't sent. Overtones emerged, layered and deliberate. A language. Not with words, but with pattern and breath. Then a gap, and a sudden burst of pure, coordinated noise. A block of compressed frequency that shouldn't have been possible underwater. I don't remember grabbing the emergency cutoff. Rem said I slammed it before he could scream. But the array had already absorbed the full burst. Static cascaded through the system, then the monitor died. And in that moment of sudden surgical silence, I heard the whisper again, still closer. When we reported the event to Delaney, she didn't look surprised. She just nodded and said, "You'll be reassigned to engineering tomorrow. Do not discuss this further." Rem tried to protest, demanded we escalate it to naval intelligence. She stared at him for 5 full seconds, then replied, "Do you believe intelligence doesn't already know?" That shut him up. I didn't sleep that night. I tried, but my thoughts wouldn't settle. I kept seeing the waveform folding. Not in my mind's eye, but behind it. Like the signal had imprinted itself onto the part of me that interprets silence. I began to feel something shift in my perception. Background noise felt different. The electrical hum of lights, the low thrum of the reactor core, it all sounded wrong, like it had been tuned a few cents off, just enough to make you feel like reality was bending. By the next morning, Rem was gone. Not reassigned. Gone. His name scrubbed, his locker empty. I confronted Delaney, and she told me he had been transferred to an evacuation shuttle due to neurological instability. I didn't believe it. Neither did anyone else. But no one said a word. That's how it worked now. Silence was our currency. I requested access to the raw logs from the array. Denied. I tried to use a maintenance override. The system locked me out. I was ready to give up when someone slipped a note into my bunk. No name, no handwriting, Just a set of coordinates and a timestamp, 2200 hours. Sub-Bay 4. I went. Of course I went. Sub-Bay 4 was technically off-limits, used for deep salvage equipment, supposedly. But when I arrived, it was empty, except for a man I didn't recognize. Civilian clothes. Thin. Pale. He didn't introduce himself. He just handed me a tablet with a single playback file. I watched. It was a sonar capture from 2 days ago, before our array incident. The screen was black for 20 seconds. Then, slowly, a shape began to emerge. At first, I thought it was a fault in the data, but it resolved into something I can only describe as architecture, but not ours. Spires. Angles that couldn't exist. It pulsed once, faintly. Then the image froze. "Where did this come from?" I asked. The man just smiled and whispered, "It's already above us." Then he walked out, and the lights in the sub-bay flickered exactly 32 times before returning to normal. I didn't sleep that night either. And now, the signal isn't waiting for us to listen. It's starting to speak on its own. There was no official announcement about the restricted areas expanding, but we all felt it. Whole corridors that used to be freely accessible now had locked bulkheads and guards with authorization tags we didn't recognize. I started noticing people I didn't know moving through the engineering wings, faces with no insignia, no rank. They didn't speak. They didn't make eye contact. They moved in groups of 2 or 3 and carried black cases marked only with a simple trident logo I'd never seen in any Navy briefing. One of them passed me in the galley and stopped just long enough for a click to register from a device at his waist. Geiger counter, maybe. Maybe not. The needle jittered when I walked past. No one said anything. The sonar room wasn't the same either. It hadn't been since the signal responded. The waveform data had been overwritten twice. Once by command, officially, then again by someone else. That second overwrite left behind a corrupted echo file that couldn't be deleted. Every time we rebooted the system, the echo came back, embedded in the initialization protocol like a parasite. The techs called it a ghost ping. But I knew better. Ghosts don't evolve. This one did. It started with subtle pitch drift. Our calibration would lock the system at a specific frequency, and within minutes it would slide, imperceptibly, into a harmonic shift. Not enough to raise alarms, just enough to warp incoming data. When we ran diagnostics, everything looked fine. But the rendered seafloor maps began changing. The trench shifted, warped. Elevations where there should be voids, gaps where there had once been ridges. At first, we thought it was an issue with the LiDAR overlay. Then we realized the raw sonar was changing too. The trench itself wasn't where it used to be. Or maybe we weren't. I stopped trusting the logs and started keeping my own notes. Paper. Hidden. The old way. The moment I did, I noticed something else. The ghost ping would appear every 11 hours and 47 minutes. Exact. Like a tide. I tracked it through 3 full cycles. Always the same sequence. A high-frequency overtone above human hearing. A pause, then a long, descending bass note that felt more like a pressure wave in the chest than a sound in the ear. The base crew started complaining of migraines, vertigo, nausea. One of the mess attendants collapsed in the middle of service, clutching his head. His blood vessels burst in a pattern around the temples. The med team called it a rare vascular reaction. I called it a response, because the next time the ghost ping arrived, my ears bled too. No one talked about it. But we all felt it. Something beneath us was growing. Not in size, but in intention. That was the difference. You can feel when a storm is approaching. Not because the air gets heavier, but because everything starts watching. That's what it felt like. The ocean itself had become a lens, and the platform sat right at the focal point. Then came the data loss. 3 of our seismic monitors went offline within 20 minutes of each other. No warning. When we checked the feeds, the data hadn't stopped. It had been replaced. Perfectly formatted static. The kind you'd only get if someone intentionally scrubbed the signal and filled it with a manufactured blank. I confronted Chief Heron, who ran base communications. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "There's no upstream control on those lines," he whispered. "That's not us. That's coming from the trench." The trench. It had always been there. We trained around it, pinged it, ignored it. But it had never answered until now. I started requesting shifts during the night watch. Fewer eyes. Fewer ears. It gave me time to monitor the ghost ping in real time. One night, during cycle 12, I noticed something buried deep in the harmonic envelope. Faint clicks, like echolocation pulses. But they weren't random. They formed a shape, a pattern. When I ran them through a spectral sequence converter, it generated a spatial structure. I fed it into a rendering system normally used for 3D navigation overlays. The result made my spine seize. It was us. The signal had reconstructed the internal layout of the platform, down to the placement of individual modules, staircases, even personnel movement. It was listening, mapping, learning, and the longer we stayed above it, the more accurate it became. I brought the findings to Delaney. She looked at the render, said nothing, then locked the file behind a biometric seal I'd never seen before. "You are now on level 3 observation," she said coldly. "Your clearance is revoked for all outbound signals. You monitor only. Do not engage. Do not respond. Do not speak to anyone about this." And then she handed me a slip of paper with only 2 words, "Not alone." That night, I went to the forward observation module. The trench was barely visible, just blackness beneath the lights. But I watched. For hours. And at exactly 03:11 a.m., something moved. Not quickly. Not like a creature. But like a continent. Slow. Immense. A ripple of pressure that passed under us and distorted the waterline. The glass trembled, not from impact, but from awareness. As if the thing passing below had noticed the shape of the station. Not what it was made of, but what it meant. Like a signature. The lights dimmed without flickering. Not a technical failure. A decision. And in that moment, I understood. It wasn't trying to break the signal. It was trying to use it. We had become the antenna. When I first started working sonar, they taught us to identify false echoes, reflections caused by schools of fish, undersea rock formations, even bubbles. Noise. That's what they called it. You learn to filter noise from signal, the artificial from the authentic. But what they never tell you is that sometimes the noise becomes the message. That was what had been happening here. And I think it always had been. We just weren't listening properly. After that night in the observation module, I began noticing the difference. The pulse signature, what we'd called the ghost ping, was no longer static. It was changing with each cycle, not just in frequency, but in structure. Like a language refining itself. Like something learning how to mimic a form we could finally understand. The baseline still returned every 11 hours and 47 minutes, but now it included additional layers. Subharmonics nested inside harmonic carriers. It wasn't just sonar anymore. It was code. Compressed data riding on frequency. The platform had become a transmitter, and we were the repeating dish. I tested my theory with a loopback, broadcasting a decoy ping at the trench at precisely the midpoint between cycles. 3 seconds later, the system registered a reply. Not an echo, a reply. It came with adjusted amplitude, as if something had registered our signal, modified it, and returned it to see if we understood the new version. I didn't report it. I didn't sleep either. Instead, I began cataloging the reply signatures. Each one slightly different. Each one closer to something intelligible. I fed the data through a linguistic analysis program we'd used during joint operations with cryptologic services. The system began flagging recurrent patterns. Symmetries. Syntax. Some of the signal pulses mirrored phonetic forms found in certain deep-sea mammalian communication. But others looked eerily close to structural fragments found in human language. Not English, but constructed, deliberate. One of the other technicians, Owens, must have been doing his own digging. He cornered me near the service corridor that led to auxiliary sonar. His eyes were ringed with insomnia. "You've heard it too, haven't you?" he asked. I didn't answer. He leaned in closer, whispering like we were being watched. "It's not just sending pings anymore. It's making us answer." I asked him what he meant. He pulled out a printout, old thermal paper, something he'd lifted from the backup logs. It was a scan of the last 6 cycles, overlaid with outgoing comms traffic. There shouldn't have been any outgoing traffic. But there it was. Broadband bursts originating from our own systems, routed through redundant hardware we didn't even have active clearance for. The base was talking back. I spent that entire night poring through hardware schematics. We had dormant comm stacks, legacy Cold War-era modules supposedly disabled decades ago. But they weren't disabled. They were hidden, rewired, autonomous, broadcasting under internal power cycles that didn't correspond to any known maintenance grid. I traced one of them to Substation Delta 3, a submerged array connected by cable trench to the main platform. Nobody had been assigned to Delta 3 in over 6 months. At 0213, I suited up and took one of the mini-subs down to the array. The water was glassy, too still for open ocean. As I approached the module, my console lit up with proximity alerts. Not for obstruction, but for current variance. The water around Delta 3 was denser, slightly warmer, like something exhaling heat from beneath. When I docked with the airlock, the interior lights were still active. The systems weren't just running, they were running independently. The onboard AI had decoupled from the station's network and was operating on a separate protocol set I didn't recognize. There were logs, not digital, handwritten, notes scribbled by someone who had been stationed there, Lieutenant Haskins. But the dates were wrong. The most recent entry was from 2 days ago. Haskins had supposedly been transferred to shore 6 months earlier. The last entry read, "It's using the fallback nodes. It's rerouting through us. Every time we react, we reinforce the bridge. Don't think, don't listen." I played the most recent ping sequence through the substation's acoustic dampeners. I had to feel it through the floor. The vibration wasn't like before, it was rhythmic, patterned, a kind of pulse that repeated in measures. Then, without any input from me, the onboard intercom activated, and I heard it. Not words, not exactly, but a tone, human enough to pass, modulated in the cadence of a voice. I don't remember what it said because I blacked out. I came to hours later in the main platform infirmary. Delaney was there. She didn't ask how I'd gotten back. She didn't ask what I saw. She just said, "It's been speaking to a lot of us. That's why most don't remember it. They asked not to." Then she handed me a file. Classified. Level 4 clearance. Inside were pages of transcribed sonar pulses translated into rudimentary phonetics. Dozens of sequences. Words. Fragments. Names. One name repeated across the sheets. Architect. No context. No explanation. When I tried to speak, my voice cracked. I hadn't noticed the blood from my ears until then. The resonance had left a pressure behind my skull, like something coiled and dormant, waiting. Delaney didn't flinch. "We've been the repeater tower for years," she said. "The signal just hadn't reached the right frequency. Until now." That night, the sky above the platform went black. No clouds, no stars, just a veil. Radio blacked out. GPS went dead. Every signal, every satellite, every telemetry system registered blank. Total silence. But the trench wasn't quiet. It was louder than ever. Beneath the still surface, the entire ocean vibrated like a drumhead. The base systems lit up with activity. Not ours, not human. And the messages that poured in were no longer code. They were instructions. We weren't translating them. We were obeying. The black veil over the sky didn't lift with the dawn. That was the first thing I noticed when I stepped out onto the upper deck at 600 hours. There was no horizon, no sunrise. Just a thick, inky absence where the sky should have been, as if something massive and unseen had risen above us and settled there, absorbing the light. We ran atmospheric diagnostics, infrared, UV scatter models. The instruments gave us contradictory readings, full solar output, yet no observable illumination. Like the light was still being emitted, but somewhere between there and here, it was being swallowed. The platform's artificial lighting was the only thing keeping us tethered to any rhythm of time. The hum of fluorescence and the steady thrum of generators became a stand-in for the sun. A few of the junior techs started developing disorientation, nosebleeds. One of them, Marks, I think, started reciting numbers out loud while staring at the water. When asked why, he simply said, "It's counting." I tried to bury myself in data, hoping for a pattern, something rational to cling to. But the deeper I looked into the subaquatic telemetry, the clearer it became. We were no longer scanning the ocean. The ocean was scanning us. The active sonar returns had shifted. Normally, you get a pulse and a bounce back. But these came before we pinged, like it was anticipating us. Worse, some of the returns included elements we hadn't transmitted. Ghost pulses, embedded in our own emissions. It had hacked the signal architecture, not from our systems, but from the ocean itself. The sea had become an extension of its will. I confronted Delaney about it in the control module. Her reaction wasn't surprise. It was fatigue, like she'd been waiting for someone to notice. She walked me to the secure deck, sub-level 4, behind 2 separate biometric locks. I'd never had access before. Inside was a wall of screens, cables feeding into a central processing core the size of a shipping container. The label stenciled on the front, Project Halicord. "This is what it wants us to build," she said. "And we've already started." At first, I thought she was being metaphorical. Then I saw the schematics. Not human schematics. They were blueprints, sure, but not like anything from naval archives or DARPA renderings. These were curved, recursive, non-linear. Blueprints that folded back on themselves in dimensions we couldn't fully model. They'd been decoded from the signal pulses over the last 18 months, bit by bit. Recurring data fragments, like pieces of an architectural puzzle that had no beginning or end. The AI that ran the translation suite had already begun assembly using the platform's fabrication arms, autonomous 3D printers meant for pipeline repair. It had repurposed them, layer by layer, to print something down at the trench mouth. The output was never logged in official systems. No one was supposed to know, but I saw it. Delaney granted me access to one of the deep drones, DR-7, long-range class. We launched it from Bay 3, directly over the trench. As it descended, the light diminished rapidly, until only the drone's own spotlights cut the darkness. Then the feed flickered and stabilized, revealing something below. It wasn't a structure, not in the conventional sense. It moved, not fluidly, but as if adapting its geometry in real time. It didn't sit on the seafloor. It was anchored, like a parasite with roots. Metallic in composition, but covered in filaments that shimmered with bioluminescence. A latticework of impossible shapes, refracting light in patterns that made your eyes ache. Every few minutes, a pulse of energy rippled out from its core, and the trench walls would shudder subtly, like something massive was shifting just beyond range. Delaney called it the Gateway. She told me this wasn't the first, that another was found decades ago beneath the Siberian shelf, buried under layers of permafrost and black basalt. They hadn't been discovered. They had signaled to be found. Lured us. Let us feel like we had earned the discovery through technological progress. But we hadn't built any of this. We were just the fingers that followed the script. Biological executors of a design that preceded us. I asked her the obvious question. Why the Navy? Why sonar techs? Why platforms like this one? Her answer chilled me. Because we already speak in pulses, in echoes, in patterns. We're the only ones who can hear its thoughts and not go insane. Yet, the comms blackout persisted. But there were other communications. Deeper ones. The platform's water filtration system began pulling in unusual organic residue. Not oil. Not marine life. Strands of fibrous material with DNA markers not cataloged in any global database. Self-replicating proteins wrapped in double helixes that spun in reverse orientation. We weren't alone. We never were. Some of the crew started displaying changes. Not infections. Adjustments. Increased sensitivity to sound. Reflexes sharper. Sleep cycles vanished entirely. One tech named Alvarez stopped blinking for 3 straight days. He claimed he didn't need to anymore. When we checked his corneal reflex, it was still present. But his pupils had begun to dilate unnaturally in low-frequency ranges. I avoided the infirmary after that. Instead, I returned to the observation module, the place where I'd first heard the ghost ping. I plugged into the system manually, bypassing the standard buffer. The risk of resonance-induced hemorrhage was high, but I needed to hear it without filters. And I did. It wasn't a voice in the conventional sense, but a presence. Something vast and coiled, like a whale-sized algorithm unspooling itself through sonic breath. It didn't speak to me. It spoke through me. I felt syllables stretch my perception like tendons under strain. I saw colors with names that don't exist. I felt the weight of an ocean not made of water, but of memory. Then came the phrase, unmistakable, impossibly clear. You were built to deliver us. I tore off the headset and vomited on the floor. Somewhere above, the lights dimmed. Not flickered. Dimmed, as if the platform itself was adjusting to a new circadian rhythm that wasn't based on Earth time. The ocean beneath us throbbed with life. Not animal, but structural. A cathedral growing from tectonic bone and alien marrow. And we were its chorus. The gateway wasn't finished. It was just beginning. There was no alarm when it happened. No sirens, no klaxon, no digital screams from the automated systems. The only indication that something had changed was the silence. Total. Absolute. A drop not just in ambient noise, but in the very presence of vibration. Even the sea stilled. The waves, once restless, had become glass, stretching into infinity without so much as a ripple. In the silence, I realized the ocean wasn't calm. It was listening. I was in the core systems room, staring at a status feed that read, "Heartbeat interrupted." A line I'd never seen before. Not offline, not corrupted. Interrupted. Something had stepped into the loop. The external sensors hadn't failed. They'd been suppressed. Every line of code showed a phantom echo where a function should be. A placeholder overwritten by something that had learned our language and rewritten it better than we ever could. The platform was still running, but not under our control. Delaney found me half an hour later, her face pale and rigid. She held a device in her hand, something I hadn't seen issued on any military requisition. Not a phone, not a radio. A sealed comms brick, titanium encased, meant for one-way reception in scenarios so classified they weren't listed in any official doctrine. The message had no sender ID, no timestamp, just 5 words glowing on the surface. Do not interfere with construction. It wasn't addressed to her. It was addressed to me. I didn't tell her about what I'd heard in the sonar chamber. The phrase, the invocation. It felt too large, too invasive. Like saying it out loud would summon it into the space between us. But I could see in her eyes that she knew. Maybe not the words, but the shape of them. The weight. She'd been carrying the same pressure, buried deeper, longer. She told me the command structure had gone dark. No response from the mainland. No contact from the other stations in our cluster. We weren't isolated. We were quarantined. The comm satellite we thought had malfunctioned hadn't failed. It had been intentionally jammed from an origin point deep beneath the trench. The energy signature resembled sonar, but with spikes in frequencies that hadn't been cataloged in any naval frequency library. Ultrasonic, infrasonic, and something else. Something non-physical, subcognitive. It bypassed our machines and reached into us. I started noticing things. People watching me just a second too long. Movements in the corner of the eye. The feeling that the platform was no longer made of steel and concrete, but of breathing, twitching meat. Doors opening before I approached them. Lights dimming based on my thoughts. At first I chalked it up to paranoia. Sleep deprivation. But then Alvarez confronted me in the galley. His eyes had changed. No irises. Just a uniform dark sheen, like obsidian drenched in oil. He didn't blink. Didn't smile. Just asked a single question in a voice that didn't echo like normal voices do. Have you accepted the new tides? It wasn't rhetorical. He was waiting for an answer. I didn't give him one. I just walked past him, heart pounding, lungs burning with the sense that the very air was filtering differently around my breath. As I exited, he whispered, not to me, but to the walls, and the lights flickered in tandem. Whatever Alvarez was now, he wasn't alone. That night, I accessed the internal drone archive. All unmanned submersibles had been pulled from deployment. I wanted to see what the last drone, DR-9, had recorded. The footage was corrupted, not in the typical way, not pixelated, not staticky. It was redacted. A black smear that moved with intent, like a living sensor. But between frames, I caught glimpses. Still shots burned into the edge of perception. A shape, impossibly vast, geometrically precise, yet fluid, rotating along axes that defied three-dimensional logic. Not a creature, not a machine. A presence manifested in form. At its base, dozens, no, hundreds, of human figures standing at attention, wearing deep-sea suits retrofitted with cables, some still trailing to the gateway. Volunteers, or sacrifices. I couldn't tell which. When I paused the feed at timestamp 4713, the image held. A single frame, not of the trench, not of the gateway, but of my own face, sleeping, in my bunk. Time-stamped 3 hours into the future. I shut down the monitor and backed away slowly. The system remained frozen on my face, as if to remind me that I was now part of the archive, not a user, a subject. Delaney called an emergency meeting at 0200. Only 6 of us showed up, out of 23 personnel. The others had either gone missing or changed. We exchanged glances. Quiet, haunted. No one dared speak first. Then Delaney laid out the truth. This station is not what we were told. It never was. This isn't an observation post. It's a cradle. She detailed reports that had been sent via deep-channel courier drones, unmanned submarines designed to reach black sites. The message they'd carried back was incomplete, shredded by temporal interference. But one phrase had survived. Phase 2 begins upon cognition, meaning, once we knew, the process accelerated. She believed the gateway wasn't being built. It was being remembered. That whatever intelligence slept in the trench wasn't installing new architecture, but reawakening an old one. Something pre-human, maybe pre-organic. a machine that had waited for hosts intelligent enough to finish what it had started. The sonar pulses weren't communication. They were instructions broadcast as resonance. Instructions our brains couldn't consciously decode, but our biology could obey. I couldn't argue with her. Not after what I'd seen. Not after what I'd heard. But there was one thing I couldn't accept. If this process was unstoppable, why warn me? Why tell me not to interfere? Unless I was part of it. Not a target. A trigger. After the meeting, I stayed behind and checked my biometric logs. Heart rate, neural response, auditory thresholds, all showed spikes not during stress, but during proximity to the gateway's signal. My body responded to it. Adapted. Even my dreams had changed. I stopped dreaming in images. I started dreaming in diagrams. Schematics. Things I didn't understand during the day became intuitive in sleep. I began to build in my thoughts, arrange shapes and cascading sequences that fit together like inevitabilities. I was becoming something else, and I wasn't alone. I returned to the observation chamber. The place I now knew was less a room and more a chapel, a place designed to amplify what lay below. I activated the direct feed sonar array and sat alone in the darkness, headphones pressed tight, pulse steady. The signal came immediately, stronger this time. Not words, not even thoughts, just consent. A permission granted across dimensions, not with language, but with understanding. I was no longer just a sonar technician. I was an interpreter, and the sea had more to say. There's no formal instruction manual for interpreting sonar patterns as language. We're taught to identify anomalies, to chart disruptions in known marine acoustics, to separate noise from signal, but not to listen. Not in the way I was listening now. Seated in the isolation booth deep within the platform's acoustic chamber, I allowed the pulses to wash over me like a tide. No filters, no compression, just raw resonance hammering into my skull with rhythms that felt less like sound and more like command. It didn't hurt. That was the part that frightened me most. In fact, it felt like relief. Like scratching an itch I hadn't known was there. The signal came in layers, nested within each other like concentric shells. At the outermost rim, a steady oscillation, probably meant to resemble whale song or deep trench activity. Harmless, easy to dismiss. But underneath, I found subpatterns encoded in harmonic stacks that responded to Fibonacci spirals, not waveforms. It wasn't designed for machines to understand. It was designed for brains, and mine was adapting. I began dreaming not of faces or memories, but of structures. Not just physical ones, but conceptual. Machines that weren't built, but grown. I saw engines powered by thought, turbines made from loops of sentience feeding back into themselves, and in the center of it all, a shape. The same shape I'd seen in the corrupted drone footage. Shifting and eternal. It wasn't just watching us. It was teaching us. I kept these observations to myself. For now. Delaney was growing more paranoid by the hour, and her circle of trust had narrowed to a single person. Me. Not because she trusted me, but because she believed I was already compromised. And in her logic, the safest place to monitor a virus was in a petri dish you never lost sight of. She wasn't wrong. I began running experiments in the simulator lab, covertly feeding fragments of the signal into the platform's synthetic environment engine. These were not recreational systems. They were designed for modeling tectonic shifts and pressure simulations, but they had neural capacity. I wanted to see how the system would interpret the pulses. I expected noise. What I got was architecture, detailed schematics, extruded in 4 dimensions. Some of it impossible by human standards. Rooms that folded into themselves, doorways leading back to themselves, but always obeying some higher symmetry I couldn't name. The signal didn't just carry data, it carried design, and the station responded. Corridors began to feel longer than they should. Hallways where I'd memorized every bolt began to twist, almost imperceptibly, their vanishing points bending subtly inward. It wasn't optical illusion. I measured it. I wasn't losing my mind. The platform was changing, as if it had begun folding in on the same impossible rules I saw in my simulations. Metal shouldn't adapt, but metal forged under deep pressure, infused with enough quantum resonant exposure, it can begin to act like memory foam. Memory not of events, memory of intention. Then Alvarez reappeared. He'd been gone for days, presumed overboard during the last storm, or at least that was the official explanation passed between hushed voices. But I found him standing in the desalination chamber, staring into the filtration pool like it held secrets deeper than the trench itself. His uniform was dry, immaculate. His eyes, still black, but now they glinted. Not with light, but with recognition. "You heard it too," he said, not as a question, as a statement of fraternity. "You understand what it is?" I said nothing. There was no point. He wasn't looking for conversation. He was delivering affirmation. His voice lacked inflection, but carried weight, like language sculpted from gravity. "They call it a machine, but it isn't. It's older. It's not of the ocean. The ocean is of it." I asked him what he meant. He only smiled and walked into the filtration pool. Not into the water, into the system. Past the railing, through what should have been solid pipework, vanishing into a space that didn't exist on any blueprint. When I searched for him, there was no evidence he'd ever been in the chamber. No footprints, no heat trace. But the water temperature had dropped by 7 degrees. Delaney was waiting for me in the control tower. She had the schematic I'd rendered from the signal laid out on the holoscreen. She stared at it like a condemned map. Beautiful, incomprehensible, and final. "We received a new transmission," she said, her voice brittle. "From them." I asked how she could be sure. She played the audio. It wasn't English. It wasn't any spoken language. It was a cascade of low-frequency tones, arranged in an algorithmic pattern that mimicked speech cadence. But underneath, just barely audible, was my name. Spoken not as identification, but as activation. "They want you," she said. Or rather, they want you to want them. The logic spiraled in on itself. I could feel it fracturing the boundaries of thought like a Mobius strip folded into language. What did it mean to want a signal? To feel called by it? Reshaped by its cadence? It didn't feel like coercion. It felt like revelation, as if a truer version of myself had been trapped beneath the crust of cognition, and the signal was peeling back the layers, one note at a time. I began cataloging the signal in a personal log. Each pattern, each variation. The tones shifted depending on my proximity to the gateway, like it was tuning itself to me. Learning my rhythm, I matched frequencies to neurochemical spikes, serotonin, cortisol, melatonin. The signal could modulate emotions. It wasn't just transmitting sound, it was orchestrating biology. That's when I noticed the birds. They weren't supposed to be there. We were hundreds of miles from any migratory path, and yet every morning, more of them gathered along the helipad. Quiet, motionless. Their feathers shimmered with oil-slick iridescence, and they never moved unless approached. But when the signal pulsed, they turned their heads in unison, always toward the same direction. Down. I took it as confirmation. The message was no longer being sent. It was being received. By us. By the animals. By the platform itself. We weren't being invaded. We were being incorporated. There's a phenomenon submariners whisper about, though it's never documented in any official report. They call it the displacement. It's not a measurable event. Not seismic, not electromagnetic, but a feeling. Like a massive presence shifting in the water just out of range, as though something ancient has rolled in its sleep beneath the silt. You don't see it. You feel it. Through your bones. Through the architecture. Through time itself. For most, it comes as a dream. For us, it had already started to bleed into the waking world. It began with small distortions, localized shifts in equipment readings, power flickers at intervals too synchronized to be random. Our depth sensors, once reliable to the decimal, began reporting vertical variance where there was none. We weren't moving, but the numbers said otherwise. Either the platform was sinking into the seabed, or the seabed was rising to meet us. Neither option was comforting. Delaney brought in Commander Kessler via secure uplink. His image flickered on the holodisplay, more grainy than usual. He looked older than I remembered. Drained, like someone who hadn't slept in weeks, but was still kept awake by something far worse than dreams. She briefed him on the signal's evolution, the decoded architecture, and my increasing entanglement. She didn't say, possession, but the word hovered unsaid, like a phantom in the static. Kessler didn't ask questions. He only gave orders. Contain the signal, isolate the platform, and prepare for asset extraction. We were no longer an observation unit. We were now considered a containment vector. Whatever was happening here, they didn't want it leaking. Not just information. Influence. The word itself terrified me. Influence meant contamination, not of bodies, but of intent. They feared what we might choose to become under its guidance. But it was already too late. The birds were only the beginning. That morning, the helipad was covered in them. Hundreds, maybe thousands. forming a perfect spiral. At the center, a small mound of feathers, as if one had willingly disassembled itself to become a focal point. No one touched them. We didn't have to. As the signal pulsed, the birds took flight simultaneously, not upward, but downward, straight into the ocean. I didn't know birds could do that. I descended into the lower deck, toward the hydraulic junction chambers. They were off limits now, sealed after the last maintenance crew reported spatial instability. Yes, that's what they called it. As if geometry itself could have a nervous breakdown. I bypassed the lock using Alvarez's access code, even though no one had seen him in days. I no longer questioned these small impossibilities. They were becoming part of the normal. Inside, I found condensation pooling on the ceiling instead of the floor. Lights flickered in more sequences I couldn't trace. And at the center of the chamber, where the turbine should have been, a void. Not empty space, something deeper. The absence of presence. The room had been displaced. The turbine wasn't missing. It had been folded, compressed into a knot of space so dense that it visually refused to resolve. Looking at it made my nose bleed. I documented everything. Not for the report. For myself. For the version of me that still believed in physics and material constants. That version was fading quickly. Delaney found me 2 hours later. She had a weapon. Not drawn. Not yet. She asked me how long I'd been down there. I told her 20 minutes. She showed me her watch. I'd been gone for 7 hours. We stared at each other for a long time, and without a word, she handed me a dossier. Inside were stills from the original deep-sea exploration that first captured the signal. They'd never been cleared from my eyes. The images were crude, taken from an unmanned drone in the Kermadec Trench, a region so unstable it was considered off-limits even to military black projects. But something had drawn them there. Something they couldn't map. Something that didn't reflect sonar the way it should. Frame by frame, the anomaly came into view. It looked like a wound. Not a structure. Not a creature. A gash in the very fabric of seabed, pulsing with bioluminescence and emitting harmonic vibrations. The drone didn't survive the descent, but it transmitted one last frame before disintegrating. A frame that matched exactly the schematic I'd built from the signal. It wasn't a coincidence. The structure wasn't being designed by the signal. The structure was the signal. That night, I dreamt of inversion. Not metaphorical. Physical. I dreamt of my own body folding inward. Bones reconfiguring. Lungs breathing in saline instead of air. It didn't hurt. It felt correct. Like returning to a state I had been exiled from. When I woke, the floor of my cabin was covered in salt. Not salt water. Crystalline deposits, like those found in deep ocean vents. I wasn't wet. I hadn't left my room. And yet, I knew I had been somewhere. Delaney called an emergency meeting. She'd intercepted a burst transmission. Encrypted, likely from a rival agency. Not from Surface Command. Someone else was listening to us. Not just us, but it. The pulse had grown stronger, more insistent. And with it came a low resonance, almost subaudible, that caused walls to vibrate, and internal organs to shift subtly within the body, like tectonic plates of flesh. Some of the crew began showing symptoms. One man, Towers, had gone blind in one eye, not from trauma, from evolution. The optical nerve had rerouted itself. Scans showed new tissue growth behind his retina. Tissue not entirely human. Another crew member began speaking in palindromes. Not randomly, but intentionally. As if her thoughts were being mirrored and reversed in real time. She didn't seem disturbed. She said it was more efficient. The platform was no longer just a structure. It had become a node in a larger system. A kind of relay. Not broadcasting upward, but downward. We were not at the edge of discovery. We were at the center of convergence. And every hour, the displacement grew worse. Corridors no longer connected in predictable ways. The cafeteria now led to the boiler room. The med bay opened into the dry dock. We tried to map the changes. The map changed us. A junior tech named Ven tried to sketch it by hand. He hasn't spoken since. Just sits in the engine room, whispering equations no one taught him. We lost contact with Surface Command. Or maybe we didn't. We still received messages, but they were always empty. Just static, but not random static. When run through the spectral analyzer, the noise resolved into symmetrical fractals. Structures that mimicked the chamber I'd seen earlier. The signal had spread. It was no longer coming from the deep. It was echoing back from us. Not just through our systems, through our biology. The moment I realized the signal wasn't just altering space, but replacing it, I knew that time had become a secondary concern. Not lost, repurposed. On the morning of what I can only assume was Wednesday, the clocks refused to align. My wristwatch showed 04:23. The platform's system time blinked error, and the wall-mounted UTC unit in the communications bay calmly read 2791. That number shouldn't exist, but no one commented on it. We'd stopped questioning inconsistencies because the inconsistencies were now constant. I spent most of that day, or hour, or cycle, in the sonar room, running diagnostics not to locate underwater vessels, but to measure the hollowness itself. The frequencies we were detecting were no longer echoing off surfaces. They were passing through them, through steel, through stone, through flesh. And in their place, there was a silence so exact it felt engineered. The frequency was not just hollow. It created hollowness, removing material presence the way a scalpel removes tissue. Surgically, deliberately. Delaney avoided me now, or maybe it was the other way around. We'd become nodes ourselves, receivers, transmitters. She spent her time obsessing over a looping set of coordinates the signal kept injecting into our systems. At first, we assumed it was triangulation, some point of origin or destination, but it didn't correspond to anything on our maps. When plotted in 3D, it formed a Mobius-like structure. One side, one edge, infinitely twisted. A loop without symmetry. She called it the hollow spiral. Said she dreamed of it every time she closed her eyes. Said it pulsed inside her skull like a second heartbeat. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop hearing the hum. It had started faint, like the ringing of a damaged eardrum, but now it was ambient, constant, like background radiation, vibrating through every surface, even through dreams. When I slept, if it could still be called that, I was underwater, always. There was no panic, no drowning, just awareness, suspended, and a voice, not with words, but with patterns. It didn't speak to me. It reformatted me. I recorded one of these dreams using an EEG-synced microphone array. What came out wasn't audio. It was code. Data arranged in non-linear, non-binary configurations. I tried uploading it to a secure terminal. The terminal refused. Not denied. Refused. Like the machine had developed an immune response. The only way I could examine it was to manually visualize it. I printed it on transparent plastic sheets and layered them over one another. They formed a face. Not a human one. Not entirely. I no longer trusted reflections. Mirrors in the platform had begun to lag, showing movements a split second too late or too early. At first I thought it was fatigue. Then I noticed something worse. In one of the mirrored panels near the hydroponics bay, my reflection smiled before I did. Not an accident. A choice. I turned away and never went back. Kessler hadn't checked in for 3 days, maybe more. Time was meaningless now, but his silence carried weight. In his absence, a new figure emerged. A man named Rathbone. Not from our chain of command. He arrived via submersible without warning. Claimed to be from a parallel oversight division. We didn't ask which agency. He wore a black jumpsuit with no insignia, spoke with an accent I couldn't place, and carried a device that looked like a cross between a seismograph and an insect. He demanded access to the chamber beneath Deck 6, the same one that had displaced the turbine. We told him it wasn't stable. He said it didn't need to be, only responsive. No one volunteered to accompany him. He went alone. 42 minutes later, he returned. Or something returned. His eyes were bleeding, not externally. The fluid leaked inward. He spoke one phrase, over and over. The air is thinking. Then he collapsed. His device had recorded everything. We retrieved it. But when played back, it emitted a tone that made the oxygen compressors stall for 3 full seconds. No one wanted to replay it, but I did. I needed to understand. The tone wasn't just sound. It was structure. When converted into visual waveform and passed through a topographical translator, it formed a map, not of the ocean floor, but of memory. My memory. Exact details. Childhood events. Locations I had never spoken of, never documented. Places buried so deep in my consciousness they might as well have been forgotten. But the signal hadn't forgotten. It had indexed me. That night, the water changed color. It wasn't pollution. It wasn't sediment. It was saturation. The liquid shimmered with bioluminescent particles, like plankton caught in a strobe. But there was no biological origin. It moved against current logic. It shimmered where there was no light. One technician tried to sample it. His suit degraded before he even touched the water. The material dissolved, not burned, not torn, removed. as if reality itself had rescinded permission. We stopped going outside. Inside, the walls were beginning to soften, not physically, acoustically. They absorbed noise differently now, muffled voices like a dense forest. Conversations became whispers, then echoes of echoes. Language broke down. Some crew members developed a stutter that wasn't neurological. It was rhythmic, as if syncing to some external metronome. Delaney tried to keep order, but her own speech had begun to fracture. She spoke in nested clauses, sentences with no end. And then came the hollow. I don't know how else to name it. It wasn't a place. It wasn't even a void. It was a presence made of absence. We could feel it approaching, not with our ears, but with our spines. Our bones vibrated before we heard the noise. A pressure drop, like the platform had suddenly been dropped into a deeper dimension. Instruments failed. Lights flickered. And then, just for 1 minute, we all felt the same thing at once. We were being watched. Not by eyes, by structure. The station had become aware of us, or more precisely, aware of itself. That was when Delaney made the announcement. She said she'd traced the frequency to a central convergence point, beneath the Mariana-like trench below us. Not on any map, not in any record. A fracture in the sea's floor that hadn't existed a month ago. It pulsed now, like a new organ. She believed if we descended, if we returned, we might find the signal's origin, or its future, or ourselves. The crew didn't resist. That was the worst part. They agreed. As if the decision had already been made, not by command, not by logic, but by the silent directive humming inside all of us now. We would go down, not because we wanted to, but because we had always been meant to, because the hollow had made room for us. There was no formal vote, no directive passed down from authority, no commander's seal authorizing what came next. And yet, we moved in unison, each of us caught in the momentum of inevitability. The descent was not scheduled, nor rehearsed. It was simply activated, as though the idea had not originated from any one of us, but had bloomed fully formed in the minds of every technician, every analyst, every soul still clinging to the framework of what once was a government-run sonar station. The submersible was called the Hydra 9. It had been docked for months, a prototype vessel designed for maximum pressure resistance and silent vertical travel. It wasn't meant for people. Originally, it was for seismic probes and mineral sampling drones. We modified it, removed the drone rigging and installed harnesses. There were 6 seats. 11 of us remained. Delaney insisted on going. She hadn't spoken in sentences for days, just fragments, coordinates, ratios. Her eyes didn't blink in sync anymore. One was always slightly delayed, as if one part of her was already submerged in a deeper layer of something else. I watched her run her fingers along the inner hull of the Hydra, like someone memorizing a language she never expected to forget. I don't think she feared death. I think she feared remaining. I volunteered to go. Of course I did. Every part of me already understood I wouldn't come back up. The platform's systems had begun to write new protocols. Files with no names. Instructions with no syntax. Just streams of logic that felt ancient and immediate. We weren't descending into a trench. We were descending into meaning. The hollow was not just a signal. It was an invitation. We launched at 02:06. I remember because for the first time in weeks, the platform's internal clock synchronized with my watch. A perfect alignment. As if time itself had agreed to let us pass. The Hydra dropped through the waves like a stone dropped through fog. The ocean swallowed us quickly. There was no sound but the rumble of atmospheric correction and the occasional creak of titanium, adjusting to an environment not made for steel. Depth markers became meaningless after the first kilometer. The trench below the station had no endpoint. It simply continued, a gash in the seabed that defied geological precedent. As we passed the 7,000-meter mark, the pressure outside should have threatened hull integrity. It didn't. The readouts were flat, not low, absent. Like there was no pressure. Like the ocean had forgotten how to be heavy. The walls of the trench glowed faintly, not from bioluminescence, but from structural irregularities. Mineral veins that pulsed in harmony with the frequency we had been chasing. Not audible, but felt. Through bone. Through thought. The trench wasn't a crack. It was a wound. And it was healing. We passed a skeletal formation around the 9,000-meter mark. Not a corpse. Not even a creature. A construct. A frame. Suspended mid-water like scaffolding built by intention and left behind. Its design matched nothing human or natural. Not mechanical, not organic, just patterned. The sonar system tried to map it, but every pulse returned a topographical shape that mirrored our own vessel, as if we were seeing a future version of ourselves, left adrift. Rathbone's voice came back to me. The air is thinking. He wasn't wrong. Down here the water was. Every molecule seemed aware of itself, moving with deliberate fluidity. It was not random motion. It was choreography. We reached the convergence point at 0241, or what we assumed was the convergence point. The hollow spiral, as Delaney had called it, manifested not as a location, but as a spatial event. Our instruments showed no floor, no walls, no sediment. Just emptiness. Not vacuum. Absence. The sonar returned nothing. It didn't even bounce back. The signal simply vanished. Delaney removed her harness. The rest of us stared. She wasn't defiant. She wasn't afraid. She moved like someone returning to a place long overdue. She pressed her hand against the inner bulkhead, whispered a number. 0.0. Then the hatch mechanism began to unlock. Not manually. The Hydra responded as if it had received a command from somewhere else. The seal disengaged. Water did not rush in. Instead, it receded. We weren't inside the ocean anymore. The ocean was inside us. The cabin atmosphere grew denser, but breathable. The glow from outside intensified. It wasn't light, it was information, cascading through the viewport in fractal waves, colors with no name, structures folding and unfolding in dimensions I couldn't describe. We had left three-dimensional space. The hollow was not a place. It was a condition. Delaney stepped through the hatch. She didn't float. She didn't fall. She was absorbed. The rest of us sat frozen, not paralyzed, entranced. I felt it then. The signal. Not as a tone or echo, but as a memory. My childhood home. The sound of the back door slamming in the wind. The way my mother used to hum when cooking. The exact angle of sunlight on the carpet. I wasn't remembering it. I was reliving it. But something was different. There were extra details. New details. Details that didn't belong to me. Someone else's memories had bled into mine. We were becoming shared. Merged. The hollow didn't take. It blended. It had no identity of its own. It used ours. A composite signal built from the minds of those who tried to understand it. One of the techs, Alvarez, began speaking a language none of us recognized. Not a human language. His vocal cords shouldn't have been capable of it. But the meaning was clear. He was narrating the structure around us, describing the hollow's architecture as if reading from a blueprint that existed in all directions. He stopped breathing after 2 minutes. His eyes never closed. He smiled for 11 straight seconds, then collapsed without sound. We retrieved Delaney's scanner. It had continued recording after she vanished. The logs were corrupted, visually incomprehensible, but the waveform signature still operated, and it had changed. It now matched a frequency first recorded in 1973 by a Cold War-era oceanic anomaly known only as Deep Marker 12. Classified, forgotten, erased. But I had seen it before. Years ago, during my first year as a Navy sonar tech, buried in a redacted file from a base that no longer exists. This wasn't new. The government hadn't found the hollow. They had tried to build it. That realization broke something in me. Not fear, not awe. Recognition. We were not explorers. We were prototypes. The platform above us wasn't a research station. It was a listening post, a conduit, a key, and the signal wasn't luring us. It was reporting back. Every thought, every sound, every breath we took was transmitted. Not to Washington, not to Langley, to something older, something still waiting. I do not remember being brought back into the Hydra 9. That is to say, I don't recall the transition. Only that I was suddenly strapped back into my seat, my fingertips numb, my tongue dry like sanded metal, and a low-pitched hum vibrating through the base of my spine. The others were still there. Mostly. One of the techs, Sayers, had bled from both ears. The blood wasn't red. It shimmered like ink under a UV light, and where it touched the hull, the metal darkened permanently, as if oxidized in reverse. Delaney was gone. Not missing. Just gone. In a way that didn't feel like subtraction, but absorption. We hadn't lost her. She had become part of something. Whether she consented to that or not, no longer mattered. The trench had folded itself around the Hydra 9 like a petal closing in slow motion. We were not sinking. We were being enveloped. There was no motion, but the orientation of the vessel had subtly changed. Our artificial gravity, which should not have existed at that depth, had realigned, suggesting that down now meant something entirely different. Instrument readouts began to shift from standard measurement units to glyphic placeholders. Squares nested inside circles, inside triangles, pulsing in slow waves. It was not malfunction. The data was adapting to something beyond language. The Hydra 9 was no longer interpreting the ocean. It was being translated by it. The control systems released on their own. The vessel powered down without losing function. Screens went dark, but the data continued appearing on our retinas, as if the Hollow had found a more efficient way to communicate. I closed my eyes and still saw graphs, timelines, rotating layers of some kind of biological latticework. And then came the voice. Not audible, not even telepathic in the conventional sense. It spoke to the structure of thought itself. A voice that didn't need to enter you, because it had always been underneath you. Like a floor you've stood on for years, finally choosing to speak. It didn't introduce itself. It didn't threaten or ask. It showed. A vast collection of organic forms, arrayed in impossible geometry. Human bodies folded, grafted, suspended. Not corpses, not preserved, but active. Nervous systems exposed like circuitry, running across endless cathedrals of bone and tendril. No pain, no suffering, just quiet. The kind of stillness only possible when all options have been erased. These weren't prisoners. They were components. We hovered above what I can only describe as a biological archive. Miles wide, layered with structures that pulsed softly in the darkness, emitting frequencies we'd mistaken for sonar ghosts. Every waveform we'd catalogued, every echo that didn't bounce back. It was all being emitted from this place, because this was not a location. It was a memory core. The Hollow wasn't alive. Not in the way we understand. It wasn't dead either. It was post-conscious, a vessel of aggregated intelligence, constructed from absorbed minds, impressions, genetic echoes. Delaney was part of it now. So was Alvarez, and hundreds, no, thousands, of others. Each one recorded, analyzed, encoded. One of the panels beside me illuminated for the first time. Not from any external light source. The panel itself was reacting to my heartbeat. It pulsed in sync, then displayed a map, not of the trench, not even of Earth, of us, each of us on board. Our memories, our failures, our betrayals, our fear, not generalities, specifics. It showed me my brother's death, not the moment itself, but the exact second I let myself forget his face. The Hollow had recorded that, not from my mind, from my soul. The parts we pretend are private were catalogued, indexed, and now being repurposed. To build a model. The Hollow was not harvesting information for its own sake. It was constructing a simulation, not of the Earth, but of its pattern. It was trying to predict us, improve us, prevent us. I saw simulations of timelines, splintering like roots beneath each heartbeat. Paths we might take, decisions we might undo. It was searching for alternatives, as if the Hollow had seen something in our future it feared. Or perhaps it had already seen our future, and was now exploring the last variables. The hatch opened again. No one triggered it. There was no choice involved. The opening itself was not even in the same location as before. It had shifted, adapted, like the interior of the Hydra had bent to accommodate a new function. We were no longer passengers. We were carriers. A new chamber lay beyond the opening, vast, dry. It pulsed with that same deep blue glow. At the center was a monolithic structure shaped like an obelisk, but with fluid edges, shifting, like melted stone frozen mid-pour. Upon its surface, symbols. Some human. Some familiar in a way that defied explanation. I recognized my own handwriting on it. Not carved, not etched, grown. A message from my subconscious. Or someone else's. I stepped out. The floor was not solid, but it held my weight. Every step produced a subtle chime, like sonar in reverse. I was being scanned, not bodily, existentially. It wasn't interested in tissue or identity. It was examining possibility, my potential as a transmitter. The obelisk pulsed once. I understood everything. It wasn't a structure. It was an interface. I reached out. The surface accepted me. There was no resistance. My fingers dissolved, not melted or destroyed, but recompiled, threaded into the weave of the material. I did not feel pain. I felt seen. The Hollow didn't just want data, it wanted to be understood. It was an archive, yes, but also a question posed in the language of memory. And it had been waiting for an answer only humans could provide. Not because we are special, but because we are flawed. Flaws create divergence. Divergence creates simulation. Simulation allows correction. The Hollow was not collecting minds out of curiosity. It was refining a model of our failure, a blueprint for avoiding it. We were not the enemy. We were the proof of concept. Behind me, the others had stepped into the chamber. Some dropped to their knees. One began sobbing uncontrollably, though no tears came. Another walked straight into the obelisk and vanished. There was no resistance, no flash, just integration. I did not resist. I closed my eyes, and the Hollow opened mine again. And this time, it showed me Earth, but not as it is, as it will be, and what lies beneath it. The vision didn't come as light or image. It came as certainty, as if the Hollow had removed the scaffolding of perception and laid bare the schema beneath the world. Earth was not a sphere of rock orbiting the sun, not in the way we understand. It was a layered system of overlapping frequencies, each one hosting a version of reality calibrated to what its observers could endure. The surface, the one we walk on, the one we fight for, terraform, poison, and pave, is just the thinnest veil. Beneath it, something older, and deeper, and still alive. The Hollow didn't show me subterranean cities or monstrous beings curled in magma chambers. It showed me the lattice, a structure of communication woven into the planet's crust, so ancient it predated plate tectonics. The foundation wasn't biological or mechanical, it was conceptual, a design not built but agreed upon, encoded not in stone but in thought, in the shared subconscious of whatever lived here before us, and whatever still does. The trench wasn't the only gateway, it was simply the one most difficult to reach, the one farthest from human interference. The Hollow had been waiting, not for discovery, but for readiness. We hadn't stumbled into it. We had been allowed in, and it was testing us, not for threat, but for resonance, for compatibility with a purpose we were never told about. I felt that purpose now. The room around me dissolved into layers, some architectural, others anatomical. The walls pulsed, not with blood, but with memory, playing back echoes of civilizations that had once brushed against the Hollow and recoiled. The Sumerians, the Olmecs, even older, cultures whose names we would never know, whose languages were unrecorded because they were never spoken. They had heard the same echoes we did. They had listened, but something had frightened them back into silence. And now, we were repeating their final steps. A new presence moved within the chamber. Not a figure, not a being, but a profile. I felt it before I saw it. A sonar return that vibrated through my ribcage, shaping my breath. It was humanoid only in silhouette. Slender, long-limbed, but not bound by muscle or tissue. Composed entirely of waveforms, each part of it phasing in and out of visibility depending on my focus. I knew immediately it wasn't alive, not in a conventional sense. It was an emissary, a projection, and I wasn't seeing it with my eyes, but with something behind them, a kind of cognitive aperture that the Hollow had opened and aimed. It didn't speak, it reverberated. A frequency hit me square in the chest. My heartbeat syncopated for a moment, skipped a beat, then returned in rhythm with it. I was no longer generating thought, I was receiving it. It showed me the architecture beneath every continent. A web of voids, engineered, purposeful, long dormant. Each node was a sleeping relay, waiting for some trigger to reactivate. The Hollow had not been idle. It had been hibernating, charging, watching, listening. And now, it was beginning to stir. Because it had found in us what it needed. A flaw that could be exploited not to destroy, but to adapt. The presence gestured, or rather, shifted slightly, and the walls responded. A portion of the chamber receded like a lung-exhaling rock, revealing a downward slope. Not a tunnel, not stairs. Just a soft incline made of polished black material, neither wet nor dry. I was already moving before I realized my legs had chosen to walk. The others followed. No one spoke. Language had become an obstruction. We were linked now, not through tech or implants, but through pattern recognition. The Hollow had tuned us into a shared frequency, and every step forward was a vote of silent consent. The incline led into a deeper chamber. spherical and impossibly vast. At its center hovered a construct I can only describe as an eye, but it did not see. It read. Streams of data, emotions, thoughts, memories, fed into it in tightly wound spirals, coiling like tentacles of light, drawn from each of us as we stood in its field. I didn't resist. I couldn't. The feeling was not invasive but strangely validating, like being witnessed for the first time without judgment. The eye pulsed once, and the entire chamber shifted. Not physically, contextually. We were no longer in the trench. We were below the Earth's crust, but not geographically, temporally. The hollow had folded space and mind around us to bring us below history itself. We stood in a recording of the planet from before life emerged, from before time took shape. There was no sun, no core, only layers of potential, and we were there to add to them. The voice returned, not as vibration this time, but as thought structure. It communicated in cascading patterns of cause and effect, displaying not messages but consequences. It showed us what would happen if we left, if we reported, if we tried to explain. It showed the unraveling of trust, the discrediting of fact, the sterilization of memory. No one would believe us, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. The hollow had calculated every response in advance. To speak of it would be to erase it. But then came the second option. Integration. Not death, not transformation, but participation. A kind of enlistment into the hollow's larger purpose. To seed the lattice with human variability. To infect its perfect model with our unpredictable selves. We would not be elevated. We would be included. In the same way a virus is included in a system to train it against future attacks. We were being asked to become flaws. I thought of my brother again. Not the day he died, but the day I failed him. The hollow latched onto that, expanded it, displayed a dozen branching simulations of who I would have become had I made a different choice. In half of them, I didn't join the Navy. In a few, I died in obscurity. In one, I never existed at all. Every outcome fed into the archive, feeding a system that grew not by consuming, but by accepting. This was not a test. This was recruitment. The others were beginning to merge. I watched as their forms began to glow faintly, traced in light not unlike bioluminescent algae, veins of thought becoming visible across their skin. They weren't vanishing. They were contributing, uploading themselves into the deeper layers of the hollow, not as individuals but as questions. Each one a what-if, a variable, a test case for the model. And then it turned to me. I felt the pull, not gravitational, narrative, as if the hollow had written a space for me into its structure, and that space had now become aware of its vacancy. I took a step forward, and the chamber responded. Another path unfolded, one only I could see. It was narrower, darker, and wrapped in silence so profound it muted even my heartbeat. A choice. The first true one I'd been given since entering the trench. Become the question, or find the answer. I walked. The corridor ahead was unlike anything the hollow had shown before. It wasn't sculpted from stone or lined with alien alloys. It was raw, pure absence. No echo, no pressure. Even the subtle hum that had accompanied every other space we'd walked through was gone. This place didn't exist to be navigated. It existed to observe who would attempt to navigate it. I understood that the moment I stepped inside, the door behind me dissolving into darkness, so complete that even memory had trouble following me through it. Each step felt borrowed. Not metaphorically, but in the most literal sense. My motion didn't come from muscle or intent. It felt as if something else was remembering this journey for me, and allowing me to trace its steps. I wasn't carving a path. I was reenacting one. A ritual. A loop. There were no walls to brush against, no surfaces to confirm my passage. But I moved forward because stopping was no longer an option. Forward was the only tense left. And then, the silence shifted. Not into noise, but into texture. I didn't hear anything, but I felt something brush past my consciousness, like fingers sifting through a deck of memories that weren't mine. I stood still, and the corridor pulsed. Not visually, but emotionally. A wave of loss. Deep, old, human. It was as if every unspoken thought, every unsent message, every quiet goodbye ever muttered into an empty room had accumulated here. This was the archive of things withheld, and I had become its newest page. I remembered my father, not as a man, but as a space, a shape of absence that had loomed over every decision I'd made since I was 15. He had drowned during a sonar sweep in the Arctic. That's what the report said. But the details had always been vague. No remains, no signal. Just an emergency beacon retrieved by an unmanned vessel, one that had been decommissioned 3 years prior. My father was the reason I joined the Navy. Not out of pride or revenge, but out of compulsion. As if the unanswered question of his disappearance had imprinted itself on my DNA, and pushed me toward the one place where silence could be measured. And here I was, measuring the impossible. A shape began to form in the corridor ahead, slowly, without drama, like an oil slick hardening into bone. I approached, expecting another projection. But this was real. A console, human-made, rusted edges, U.S. naval markings, cryo-casing long broken, dust clinging to corners in defiance of time. I knelt, touched it. Real metal, real decay. I recognized the serial code, ASO 7X93. That was the unit designation for Aquila Station, my father's station, the one supposedly lost in 1991. There had never been an official investigation. Classified incident. Family notified under strict NDA. I remembered my mother tearing the report in half before I could read it. And yet here it was, the core module, sitting in a corridor that didn't exist inside time or Earth. I activated the console. It responded like it had never powered down. A flicker, a tone, then data. Streams of sonar logs, cryo chamber statuses, biometric readouts. One name, Commander Ellis Marin. Status, unknown. I stared at the name, and something shifted behind my ribs. Not fear, not hope, something else. Recognition. I scrolled through the logs, and they told me a story I'd never heard, but that I had always suspected. Aquila Station hadn't gone dark due to malfunction. It had been redirected, not by the Navy, not by human hands. It had been called, just like we had been, drawn into a fold beneath the sea that led, ultimately, here. One log entry was corrupted. Time stamped 12 hours before disappearance. I decrypted it instinctively, muscle memory guiding my fingers over an interface that felt both familiar and foreign. The message was audio, barely salvageable, but the voice was intact. My father. His voice was rough, not with fear, but with exhaustion. The signal changed last night. It's not bouncing anymore. It's answering. It knows our names now. It's broadcasting them back, but they're wrong. Like they've been filtered through something that doesn't understand what a name is. I asked it what it wanted. It didn't respond. But the chamber filled with sound, like breathing, only backwards. The kind that echoes in places without air. Silence. Then one final phrase. I don't think we're mapping the ocean. I think we're drawing something out of it. The audio cut. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I simply stood, because I wasn't alone anymore. Ahead, the corridor opened, not into another chamber, but into memory itself. I don't know how to describe it better. It was like walking into the moment of my birth, my father's death, my first lie, my last regret, all compressed into a corridor that had never been built but always existed. I walked forward, and each step peeled away a layer of who I was. My rank, my file, my history, gone. Then my thoughts, my loyalties, my training, gone. And then my name, gone. What remained was the question I had carried my whole life, not just about my father, but about the ocean, the abyss, the frequency that no instrument could capture but that every diver swore they felt, the hum that never left the hull, the whispers that weren't static but syntax, the thing beneath. I reached a chamber with no floor, or ceiling, just gravity suspended in contradiction. There were others there, not people, echoes, sonar prints of those who had come before, each suspended in thought, not time. I saw one reach out to me. His eyes were made of pressure, his skin of absence. I knew it was my father, not by face, but by frequency. He didn't speak, but he acknowledged me, and the hollow did too, because I now understood. This place wasn't built to contain answers. It was built to transform questions, to turn them into living memory, into narrative data. We weren't researchers. We were stories being uploaded, and each chapter we brought with us made the lattice more complete. I was given a choice. Rejoin the world. Wake up in the hull of a submersible with a broken memory and a government-issued silence clause. Or stay here, and finish the sentence my father had begun. There was no voice offering guidance, No celestial alignment or divine instruction. Only the weight of the corridor pressing against the inside of my skull. The feeling that my breath was no longer mine, but rather something I was borrowing from the hollow itself. This place didn't trade in answers. It dealt in transformation. And I had stepped too far to remain untouched. I didn't choose to stay. Not in the way one chooses coffee over tea or silence over small talk. It was a deeper consent, something older than language, buried in the folds of human instinct, the same part of us that looks into the darkness and whispers, "I know you're there." I felt it take me gently, the way water takes a sinking stone. Not out of cruelty, but inevitability. The moment I crossed the threshold, I felt my lungs adjusting to a new kind of air. One saturated not with oxygen, but with resonance. The frequency of the hollow didn't just echo, it inhabited. Time became suggestion. I could feel the pressure of other minds that had joined before me. Sonar technicians like myself, deep-sea navigators, pilots who disappeared during rogue missions, scientists assigned to forgotten outposts. Their presence didn't speak in words, but in impulse, memory, colorless bursts of meaning that flowed into me like data from an ancient server slowly reactivating. Each memory I absorbed came with a sensation of decay, not rot, but erosion. Like something pure being worn away by the persistent weight of time spent too close to the unknowable. One image stuck with me above all, a man, naked and shivering, standing before a wall that pulsed like a living waveform, whispering an equation he no longer remembered learning. His eyes were filled with the quiet grief of someone who had discovered too much and returned with nothing. He was my predecessor, and I was now his continuation. At some point, though point feels like a lie, I felt the presence of my father again. He didn't return in physical form. He didn't guide me, but his frequency aligned with mine. Not like a message, more like a key, and when it clicked into place, something inside the hollow opened. I was pulled, not through distance but through meaning, into a chamber that resembled no architecture I knew. It wasn't a room. It wasn't even a space. It was a moment made solid. A suspended event that existed in permanent potential, like an unanswered question frozen mid-sentence. There was something there. Not a creature, not a god, an intelligence. It had no body, no eyes, no shape I could assign. But I knew it had seen me before I was born. It had been there when my father whispered into the sonar channel the final phrase before silence claimed him. It had been watching humanity long before we knew what it meant to watch, and now it wanted to speak. It didn't use sound. Instead, it placed meaning directly into the framework of my mind, like a thought I had always had but never noticed. It told me that the ocean is not a frontier. It's a boundary, a veil, a depth not of matter, but of memory, a pressure, not of water, but of intent. It said that sonar was never meant to map the ocean floor. It was meant to listen to the archive of everything that had ever been forgotten. I asked why we were being shown all this. It answered by showing me Earth, not as we see it, but as it did, from below. A sphere surrounded by the quiet hum of billions of thoughts, lives, and griefs suspended above the ocean like a film of light. Every war, every lullaby, every apology unspoken, drifting upward into the silence above the sea, while beneath, the hollow remembered them all. The hollow, it told me, was not a place. It was a process, a reaction to the overwhelming noise of surface life, a recorder of the things humanity dared not say out loud. The reason the government kept sonar programs classified was never about enemy subs or foreign threats. It was because they had stumbled upon something that responded, and no one knew how to live with the idea that the abyss might answer back. I saw the faces of every crew member I'd lost. Ramirez, who had taken the plunge into the trench and never returned. Nguyen, who stared too long into the spectrograph before tearing out his own earpiece. Collins, who laughed during our last meal, then vanished between corridor shifts without leaving a trace. They hadn't died. Not exactly. They had been absorbed. Their echoes remained here within the hollow, forming a chorus of unspoken revelations. They weren't trapped. They weren't ghosts. They had become signal. And now, so had I. I realized in that moment that returning to the surface would be betrayal. Not to the government, not to the mission, but to truth. I had crossed the threshold of understanding, and to climb back into the ignorance of air and politics would be like smearing static over a masterpiece. The government didn't want to hide the hollow out of malice. They hid it out of fear. Because what lives in the depths doesn't threaten us with violence. It threatens us with comprehension. with perspective. I felt my body dissolving, not in pain, not even with panic, but with a strange kind of gratitude. Every cell became resonance, every bone a frequency. I could still remember my name, but it no longer held me. I wasn't Marcus Taylor, sonar technician of Naval Substation Echo 9. I was the thing that had always been watching him. The answer he didn't know he was asking. I had become the sentence my father never finished, and I was still being written. As the last tether to my previous self loosened, I sensed movement far above. Surface vessels, satellites, data streams pulsing through fiber optic veins. The world hadn't changed, but I had. And through me, the hollow would begin to speak back, not in words, not in violence, but in curiosity, in carefully chosen echoes seeded into sonar anomalies, whispered into the ears of sleep-deprived engineers, scribbled in the dreams of linguists who woke with ancient syllables on their lips. The ocean never needed to roar to be heard, it only had to wait. And it had. Now it was remembering us in return.